Here's a man. Let's call him Matt. Matt is 35. He has never once, in his adult life, called his father to ask how to do something he could figure out himself. Not the leaking faucet, not the flat tire on the shoulder of the highway at 11 p.m., not the year he moved to a city he'd never visited, with no job lined up, because he'd read good things about it online. He does not use GPS voice guidance if he's been somewhere twice. He just remembers. He built a shed from a video he watched once and a stubbornness nobody asked him to develop. He is not reckless. He is not performing independence for an audience, because there is no audience. He is, according to actual peer-reviewed developmental research published in journals real psychologists read, running on a piece of software installed in his brain sometime around 1998 by nobody, on purpose, by accident, during a childhood that adults at the time were quietly worried might be ruining him. Nobody saw that coming, least of all the institutions that spent the 1990s worrying about exactly this. Because the agreement everyone reached, somewhere between the milk carton missing kid campaigns and the nightly news specials, was very clear, very confident, and it turns out spectacularly incomplete. Unsupervised kids were kids in danger. A child outside without an adult wasn't free. He was unprotected. Stranger danger assemblies were held in gymnasiums. Nightly news anchors leaned into the camera with the specific, practiced concern reserved for parents watching at home. Child safety experts testified. The whole apparatus of official adult alarm cranked up to maximum and pointed directly at exactly the thing Matt was doing every single afternoon. Existing outside, unsupervised, making his own decisions, for hours, with nobody checking. And then those kids grew up. You don't want to hear this, but here it is anyway. A researcher named Joe Frost spent years measuring something almost nobody thinks to measure: how far kids are actually allowed to travel from their own front door without an adult. Not how far they could travel, how far they're permitted to. Since 1970, that number has collapsed by roughly 90%. Not kids play outside less, which is the vague, comfortable version of this story everyone already knows. A specific 90% shrinkage in the actual physical radius of a child's independent world. Matt was on the last side of that number. His mother's entire supervisory instruction most summer days was 5 words. Home when the streetlights come on. Between that sentence and dinner, nobody knew exactly where he was. Neither did he, most of the time, in the sense that mattered. He was wherever the day had taken him, solving whatever the day had put in front of him, with a group of other unsupervised kids who were doing the same thing. That wasn't neglect. Researchers have had 30 years to work out what it actually was. It was an accidental national experiment in self-sufficiency, running in millions of houses simultaneously, with no design, no funding, and no idea it was building anything at all. Here's where the story stops being predictable, because what researchers eventually found when they finally sat down and studied this, rather than just worrying about it, matched none of the official 1990s predictions. Not one. A psychology professor at Boston College named Peter Gray, along with colleagues, published research in the Journal of Pediatrics directly connecting the decades-long decline in unsupervised, independent childhood activity to the rise in anxiety, depression, and suicide among children and teenagers. Not the phone. Not social media, at least not primarily. The disappearance of unsupervised time itself. The logic, once you hear it, is almost embarrassingly simple. Confidence isn't handed to a child. It's built, one small solved problem at a time, with nobody around to solve it for you. A kid who never gets lost, never learns he can find his way back. A kid who never has a real disagreement with a friend, unmediated by an adult, never learns he can survive conflict without a referee. Take away the unsupervised hours, and you take away the only place those reps ever happened. The kids who got the least supervision, and by extension, the most practice, are, statistically, some of the least anxious adults in the room today. The real reason today's kids report record anxiety has nothing to do with the obvious scapegoat everyone reaches for first. The phone is part of it. But researchers keep finding the same underlying variable sitting underneath the phone. Nobody is home when the streetlights come on anymore, because there is no version of home when the streetlights come on left to be home for. Here's a fact that almost never makes it into this conversation, and it might be the strangest piece of evidence in the entire research base. Emotional breakdowns and suicide rates among school-age kids have been shown, repeatedly, to drop every summer when school lets out, and rise again once the structured, supervised school year resumes. Sit with that. Not kids feel happier in summer as some soft, seasonal vibe. A measurable pattern, tracked year after year, tied to the return of adult-controlled, adult-scheduled time. For Matt's generation, summer was the closest thing left to the old world. No structure, no supervision. Just him, a bike, and whoever else's mom had also run out of patience by 10 a.m. That single seasonal pattern is one of the clearest pieces of evidence anyone has found that independence isn't a nice to have. It behaves, in the data, almost like a nutrient. Remove it, and something measurable breaks. Bring it back, even for 8 weeks a year, and something measurable gets better. Nobody mentions this in the kids these days conversation. It's too specific, and it points somewhere most people don't want to look. Not at the kid's phone, but at every adult run hour surrounding it. In December of 2014, in a quiet suburb of Silver Spring, Maryland, 2 kids, 10 and 6, were walking home from a park about a mile from their house. Their parents, Danielle and Alexander Mative, had dropped them off and told them to be back by a certain time. It was broad daylight. The kids knew their address. They knew their phone number. They'd done the walk before. Someone saw 2 children walking without an adult and called the police. The kids were picked up, held, and eventually returned home hours later without their parents being called first. Child Protective Services opened an investigation. In April, it happened again. A different park, the same result. This time the children held even longer while their parents had no idea where they were. The state ultimately ruled the family responsible for unsubstantiated child neglect, a finding confusing enough that even officials struggled to explain exactly what it meant, beyond a file being kept open on the family for 5 years. Their crime, as far as anyone could establish, was letting 2 kids do almost exactly what Matt did every single day of his childhood. The Matives were eventually cleared, twice, and Maryland changed its policy afterward to clarify that walking or playing outside unsupervised isn't, by itself, neglect. But the case became the modern proof of something researchers had already been documenting quietly for years. Since 1974, child neglect law in the U.S. has been broad enough that ordinary, age-appropriate independence, the exact independence the data says builds confident adults, can trigger an actual state investigation. The skill didn't just fade out on its own. Part of it got legislated out from under kids who were doing nothing wrong. Here's the real truth, and it's the one distinction that explains why supervised activities never quite replace what Matt had. Researchers define genuine play as something a child initiates and controls. The instant an adult steps in to organize it, schedule it, or referee it, it stops being play. It becomes an activity. And an activity, however fun, doesn't reach the same part of a developing brain. This is why a scheduled, adult-run sports league, as good as it is for a kid, doesn't fully substitute for an unstructured afternoon with no plan and no adult in charge. One produces a well-run hour. The other produces a kid who has to decide, on his own, what happens next, and lives with the consequences of that decision, good or bad, without a whistle to blow. Matt didn't know this distinction existed. He just knew that some afternoons had a coach, and some afternoons didn't, and the ones without a coach were the ones where he actually had to figure something out. There's a specific finding in this research that should have gotten more attention than it did. Kids with more independent access to their own neighborhood, walking, biking, roaming a few blocks on their own, ended up with stronger relationships to the actual people around them and reported less loneliness than kids whose movement was tightly restricted. That's counterintuitive if you think about it purely as a safety trade-off. More freedom should, in theory, mean more risk and less stability. Instead, it produced more connection. A kid roaming a neighborhood runs into people. The retired guy who always waves. The older kids who explain the local rules. The neighbor who yells at you for cutting through the yard but not seriously. All of it is unscheduled, ambient contact that a structured playdate, however well-intentioned, can't quite manufacture on a calendar. Millennials, without realizing it, were absorbing a version of belonging that barely exists anymore. One built out of 100 small, uninstructed interactions instead of a handful of supervised ones. Risky play specifically compounds this. Kids who climbed higher than felt totally comfortable, explored somewhere unfamiliar, took on something with a small, real chance of failure. That specific category of play has been linked to lower rates of phobia later in life, and to the kind of practical self-confidence that shows up decades later in an actual emergency, because the brain already has a file open labeled, "I've handled hard things before, alone." That file is the actual skill, not the bike, not the tree. The accumulated, embodied evidence that you're someone who can figure it out. So where did all of this actually go? It didn't disappear when Matt turned 18. It relocated. It's in the way he doesn't call anyone before attempting a repair he's never attempted before. It's in the fact that getting lost in an unfamiliar city produces mild curiosity in him instead of panic. He's been lost before, on a bike, 3 miles from home, with no phone, and found his way back every single time. It's in the specific, quiet confidence of someone who has already survived being alone with a problem, thousands of separate times, before he ever had to survive anything that actually mattered. Matt was never taught self-reliance in a classroom. Nobody could have taught it. It only builds one way, through unsupervised hours with a real, if small, chance of things going wrong, and no adult there to catch it. More guidance, less practice. That's the trade the current generation is quietly getting instead. And the research, uncomfortably, keeps landing in the same place. More supervision, more anxiety. Less unsupervised time, less confidence. Nobody voted on this trade. It happened 90% at a time. The world spent 50 years trying to protect kids from every visible risk, and in the process, quietly removed the exact practice that used to build the resilience to handle risk when it eventually shows up anyway, because it always does. Matt didn't get the new deal. He got the old one. Go figure it out. Be back by dinner. Nobody designed it as an experiment. Nobody applied for a grant. It just happened, one open afternoon at a time, across millions of houses, in the decade before anyone thought to measure what it was building. And now, decades later, researchers with clipboards and journals and control groups are only just catching up to something Matt's generation already knew without needing the data. They were never the neglected kids the milk cartons warned everyone about. They were the last kids in the experiment nobody designed. And it turns out they were right all along.